Personal grievances can escalate to the destruction of careers, international incidents, or change the course of history. From John Lennon and Paul McCartney writing diss tracks about each other, to Gandhi facing off against Winston Churchill, I'm Mike with List 25, and here are 25 feuds historical figures have had over petty things. 25. Leonardo da Vinci vs. Michelangelo. These two great artists carved themselves into art history with sculptures, paintings, and revolutionary techniques. However, they never quite saw eye to eye, despite both coming from similar backgrounds and being trained in Florence. Michelangelo apparently made fun of Da Vinci for not completing a famous statue, while Da Vinci once recommended that Michelangelo's most famous work, David, should be censored. This wasn't their only sour encounter either. They were both once commissioned to paint the Salone di Cinquecento. If the work had gone ahead as intended, their conflicting artistic interpretations would have been the earliest evidence of their rivalry, but they were both called away to other projects before the work could begin. 24. Winston Churchill vs. Lady Astor. Winston Churchill's name precedes him, a bullish British Prime Minister famous for his strong-handed leadership during the Second World War. But that didn't make him immune from feuds, even from within his own party. One of his biggest critics was Lady Astor, a long-serving Conservative MP for Plymouth Sutton. To give you an idea of how they felt about one another, one exchange involved Lady Astor telling Churchill that she would put poison in his tea if she were married to him. Churchill replied that he would drink it with pleasure if the two were ever married. 23. Alexander Hamilton vs. Thomas Jefferson. In the years following the American Revolution, decisions would set a precedent and direction for the states for centuries to come. And for Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, these matters spilled over into personal rivalry. They both had been founding fathers, served as part of George Washington's first cabinet, and had radically different viewpoints. This motivated Jefferson to create the Republican Party to defend the nation against Hamilton's version of empowering financial interests. The two constantly clashed throughout their time working together, though they rarely commented on each other in public, and if they did, it was usually to compliment one another. 22. Charles Darwin vs. Richard Owen. Who comes to mind if you think of evolution? Probably the long-bearded scientist, Charles Darwin. The man is credited with some of the most revolutionary ideas in biology, but he still had his fair share of detractors. His biggest by far was Richard Owen, a renowned paleontologist who was certain that Darwin was fundamentally wrong about the way nature worked, a position against Darwin's that had earned him a place in history as a villain. Owen was extremely religious and determined to connect biology with the divine creator. But he was concerned enough about his reputation to criticize Darwin's famous Origin of Species through an anonymous article rather than use his real name. 21. Harry Houdini vs. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Harry Houdini was the first magician to become truly world famous for his work. Arthur Conan Doyle, on the other hand, was the writer behind Sherlock Holmes. At first, the two were close, bonding as part of the spiritualist movement. Behind closed doors, however, Houdini had much less faith in his friend. When Doyle discovered Houdini's skepticism, their friendship collapsed, spilling into the public, where Houdini called Doyle one of the greatest dupes in history. This was the foundation of a wedge that only grew larger when Doyle's wife claimed to have contacted Houdini's dead mother. While Doyle founded a $2,500 prize to a medium who could withstand scrutiny, a sum worth almost $50,000 today, Houdini worked as a skeptical judge and eventually published a lengthy pamphlet to debunk self-proclaimed mediums. 20. Salvador Dali vs. the Surrealists. Salvador Dali was heavily involved in an art movement called Surrealism. As the name suggests, this kind of art explores imagination, dreams, and the non-material world, often seen as a representation of unconscious thoughts or concepts. But Dali didn't fall neatly into the category of left-wing artists in the movement. During the rise of European dictators like Hitler and Mussolini, these differences became more and more apparent. He was accused of glorifying fascism, an accusation that had kicked him out of the movement. Dali argued that his art had been misunderstood, and he claimed that he was the real surrealist. 19. Eleanor Roosevelt vs. J. Edgar Hoover. In the early days of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover steered the ship, from the organization's founding in 1935 until he died in 1972. He dealt with issues of national security, but also more than his fair share of political clashes. Few more famous than his feud with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The FBI was keeping a dirty file on Eleanor's personal life, an investigation that concluded that the First Lady was having an affair with a well-known Army Air Corps sergeant. After hearing this, the president had a huge fight with Eleanor, reassigned hundreds of military personnel, and shut down an entire branch of the army. In other words, there was probably some truth to it. 18. John Lennon vs. Paul McCartney. Who broke up the Beatles? Well, it depends on who you ask. At the center of the band was the songwriting pair of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but their differences made it impossible to work together. John is on record calling Paul's solo music rubbish and complaining that Paul wanted his bandmates to position him at the center of the band. Paul said that John had, quote, turned nasty and was the one who decided to end it all. Their feud was so strong that they wrote songs about one another, but fortunately they did finally reconcile before John died. Also, a little bit of fun fact here. I don't know if it's fun if you're a Beatles fan, but the place where the Beatles officially broke up is actually at Disney World, at the Polynesian Village, room 1601, and I actually have photos. So yeah, throw these in, throw some photos. You'll see, I took photos of the front door and from the it's not a balcony, it's literally on the first floor, the outside of it. So if you want to see part of music history, it's not where this happened. This is room 1601 at Polynesian Village at Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. That is where John signed the official paperwork to officially end the Beatles. He was sitting there. That's where the Beatles officially ended. So if you're ever in Disney and you want to see some music history, go to Polynesian Village. 17. Nikita Khrushchev versus Richard Nixon. During the Cold War, the heads of each state were US President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, both strong personalities. Their most famous exchange happened at the American National Exhibition, being held in Moscow in 1959. The two superpower leaders began debating the advantages of capitalism versus communism, a disagreement that soon descended into threats of aggression. The two eventually shook hands, but the so-called kitchen debate has gone down as one of the most tense moments of the Cold War era. Another fun fact, Disney related as well, Richard Nixon gave his "I'm not a crook" speech at the Ballroom of the Americas right next door to the Polynesian at the Contemporary Hotel at Walt Disney World. So you have the Beatles breaking up at the Polynesian and "I am not a crook" at the Contemporary. So more history, Disney. You're welcome. 16. Henry VIII versus Anne of Cleves. Henry VIII was famous for 6 wives. His fourth, Anne of Cleves, was selected from her portrait alone before Henry had ever met the woman. Having grown up in Dusseldorf in Germany, the two didn't have many things in common. Usually it helps if you speak the same language. Their romance didn't get off to a great start either. In their first meeting, Henry dressed up as a commoner to surprise his new wife, reacted with disgust, physically pushing the king away. Unsurprisingly, their marriage lasted only 6 months before the union was annulled. Well, at least she wasn't sentenced to death like his first 2 wives. 15. Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams. Although they usually considered themselves friends, Jefferson clashed with Adams over several issues, more or less civilly, until George Washington stepped down from power and the two fought to grab control. Running against each other in a presidential campaign drove an even greater wedge between them. Personal insults were traded, leaving deep wounds where they didn't talk for 12 years. 14. Charles Dickens vs. Hans Christian Andersen. Writers can be temperamental at the best of times. And it was the worst of times. Sorry, I had to throw it in there. Despite being famous for the cherished fairy tales like The Ugly Duckling and The Little Mermaid, Andersen was a less than considerate guest. At least, that's according to Dickens, after the Danish author spent 5 weeks at his house in Kent. A private letter sold at auction in 2017 revealed that Dickens thought Andersen's English, French, and even his Danish were not fit for a writer. 13. Henry Ford vs. the Chicago Tribune. Henry Ford's enterprising made the US the powerhouse of the emerging automobile industry, but not everyone was on board. The Chicago Tribune attacked him as an anarchist and ignorant idealist with, quote, no common sense. Ford, whose Model T was fast becoming the most popular automobile in the country, sued the newspaper for $1 million in a trial that involved private detectives, publicity stunts, and 2 million words of evidence. After more than 3 months, the jury ruled in Ford's favor, and in the end, each side lost, having poured $500,000 into trial expenses. 12. Queen Elizabeth I versus Thomas Seymour. Elizabeth lived with her father's 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, following Henry VIII's death. She had married a man named Thomas Seymour who harassed teenage Elizabeth, including invading her bedroom and making unwanted physical contact, after he professed his love to her, despite their 25-year age gap. His behavior eventually caught up with him when he was arrested and executed for treason, as he had been scheming to take over the royal family for years. 11. Tsar Peter the Great versus beards. Okay, so this one isn't actually exactly between two historical figures, but it did shape history for some time. Tsar Peter, better known as Peter the Great, found that one of his greatest enemies wasn't the Ottomans nor the Swedish. Instead, Peter despised beards. It stemmed from his vision for Russia to transform itself into a more European country. That went for facial hair too, which he preferred to be clean cut rather than long and thick. To enforce the rule, he instituted a beard tax, which required payment each year, which could be proven by a specialized token to display to authorities. If not, it would be cut off. And if you want to check out more facts about beards, check out the first ever video where I was on camera. 25 facts about beards. Seriously, I mentioned this fact, and I haven't talked about that fact in 8 years. Wow. Yeah. 25 facts about beards. That is the very first video I ever appeared on camera. Before that, I was just a voiceover. So check that out. List 25 history. Speaking of history. 10. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart versus Antonio Salieri. Ever feel like there might be someone stopping you from getting ahead? Antonio Salieri was a classical Italian composer and contemporary of the young, brilliant Mozart. Mozart believed that Salieri, acting as a powerful influence in the Italian music scene, was inhibiting his career progression and from breaking into European stardom. It's no surprise that after Mozart's sudden and young death, rumors spread that it was Salieri. Plays, books, and films repeated the conspiracy, but there was little truth to the accusations. Mozart had suffered from debilitating mental and physical illnesses since he was a child. 9. Sigmund Freud versus Carl Jung. Initially, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung had been interlocutors, full of mutual respect for one another. However, their egos soon got in the way of having a constructive relationship. Freud viewed Jung as more of a son and heir, but differences developed from their psychological approaches. Freud looked at sex as the primary driver of human action, while Jung believed that there was an array of psychic energy that shaped behavior. One argument they had while touring the US left Freud fainting. As Jung grew more accomplished, their relationship fractured, and despite the uneasiness they maintained until Freud's death, the two titans of psychology are often painted as bitter rivals. 8. Isaac Newton versus Robert Hooke. Compared to Isaac Newton, English scientist Robert Hooke is almost completely unknown. Newton and Hooke discussed theories about gravity in the build-up to Newton publishing his work Principia, which enraged Hooke, who wanted credit for helping develop Newton's work. In the popular imagination, Newton's comment that his work was built on the shoulder of giants is thought to be a mocking reference to Hooke, who was known to be a short man. But this quote came in their early relationship when there was still plenty of respect. In the battle for publicity, though, Newton won, and many believe that it was a deliberate, concerted effort to remove Hooke's name from the history books. 7. Vincent van Gogh versus Paul Gauguin. Ever had a bad roommate before? Paul Gauguin certainly has. The painter once lived together in a house with Vincent van Gogh in the south of France. During their time living together, the two produced dozens of paintings, inspiring and motivating one another. But it was here that Van Gogh took a knife to his ear, enough of a violent outburst for Gauguin to leave and never look back. 6. Andrew Jackson versus Charles Dickinson. Among Andrew Jackson's many political enemies was an author, Charles Dickinson, whose anger came from a horse racing debt. Decades before Jackson became president, he offered to race his horse against one owned by the father-in-law of Dickinson. A disagreement over how much should be paid led to Jackson calling Dickinson's father-in-law a damned liar and a cowardly talebearer. Dickinson soon fired back in his father-in-law's defense, calling Jackson a worthless scoundrel and proposing a duel. In the gun exchange, both Dickinson and Jackson were shot. However, it turned out that Dickinson's wound was much more serious, leading to his death later that evening. 5. Abraham Lincoln versus James Shields. Much like Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln was a man of pride and principle. He was willing to die for his reputation, something that drove him to accept the duel of a man named James Shields, who was the state auditor of Illinois and became subject to political attacks when he helped close the Illinois State Bank, leaving thousands of residents without access to their money. Lincoln was a harsh critic of the policy and wrote a scathing personal attack on Shields in a prominent newspaper. After failing to receive a retraction, Shields challenged Lincoln to a duel. Lincoln chose broadswords as the weapon to be used, and after he sliced the branch of a tree high above Shields' head, well, that was enough for them both to agree to call the duel off. 4. Mahatma Gandhi versus Winston Churchill. Mahatma Gandhi was an Indian icon who drew as much controversy as he did respect. As a symbol of Indian independence, a natural opponent for Gandhi was the head of the English establishment, Winston Churchill. Even before he rose to the post of Prime Minister, as a member of Parliament, Churchill became fixated with Gandhi and strongly advocated that the British shouldn't negotiate at all. This feeling only intensified when he became Prime Minister, as Gandhi urged the Indian army and political system not to help Britain in the war effort. 3. Ernest Hemingway versus F. Scott Fitzgerald. In the early 20th century, when American literature was at its peak, two men stood above the rest: Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Hemingway was a traditionally masculine character, infatuated with bullfighting, boxing, women, and drinking hard liquor. On the other hand, Fitzgerald was a preen and proper product of his Ivy League education, which offered a more feminine and sensitive version of masculinity. There was a healthy rivalry between the two, though, which exploded after Hemingway accused Fitzgerald of not calling a stop to a boxing round while timekeeping, allowing Hemingway to be knocked out. Still, their relationship is one of great literary interest and has been subject to significant debate, including the idea that the two shared repressed homosexual tendencies. 2. King Louis Philippe versus the Mexican government. How much is a cake worth? How about a country? In 1832, the French were spurred into intervening in Mexico after a pastry chef reported that Mexican authorities had stolen merchandise from his property in Mexico City. King Louis Philippe, the French monarch of the time, took swift action by blocking all sea trade in and out of Mexico. The incident led to a military confrontation, which ended when Mexico agreed to a fine of 600,000 pesos. For decades, this payment remained unpaid, which was part of the reason for France invading the country later in 1861. 1. Dassler Brothers. Brothers Adolf and Rudolf Dassler went into the shoewear business together at a young age. They found their greatest success by convincing American runner Jesse Owens to wear their product at the 1936 Olympics. This explosion of success brought with it new problems. Adolf and Rudolf, or Addie and Rudy as they were nicknamed, had grown distrustful of one another, causing them to part ways in 1948. Rudy quickly created a company he called Puma, while Addie similarly created his own enterprise, which he named Adidas. Employees and resources of their former company were split between the two. Each company went on to become a global giant in the sportswear world, but the Dassler brothers went to their grave refusing to make amends. So, what's the biggest feud you've ever had? Let us know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and check out our social medias, including my personal ones, links in that description. Now, did you know that Winston Churchill was responsible for 3 million deaths, and that they weren't during wartime? Or how about Frank Sinatra's suspicious ties to the mafia? Well, guess what? I explore all of that in 25 unpleasant facts about history's best people. So for more, click right here to keep learning. Go ahead. Learn, not look. Just it's interesting. History's best people. Their worst things. Check that out. It's really cool. That was a man, that's an older video. Check it out and find out.